Hi, my name's Jeffrey. I'm an amateur audio engineer, and you're about to learn how not to make the mistake I made when using the Haas effect to turn a mono track into a wide stereo image. If you're not familiar with the Haas effect, it's a method to take a mono track and give it a stereo spread by duplicating it, like this, and then sending one track full left, and sending the other track full right, and then applying a delay of a few milliseconds on one of the tracks. If you want to hear what that sounds like, it hits you best with headphones on, but no matter what, you have to be listening in a stereo environment. But first, let's hear what the Haas effect sounds like. I'll play the loop without the Haas effect, and it'll sound like a mono track right dead center. Then I'll turn on the Haas effect, and you'll hear the difference. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Yeah, I fell in love with that sound, and since it also meant I didn't have to double track, I used it all the time. And life was good until I started to travel a lot and got one of these, a Bluetooth speaker. And this thing is great. It was easy to pack, sounded good in a hotel room, and I was completely happy until one of my songs came up on the playlist, and the rhythm guitar that I'd used the Haas effect on sounded thin and weak. The problem was that the speaker system just had one speaker, so it plays back in mono. And I had not yet learned the importance of mixing in mono and testing the mix every once in a while in mono. And, of course, since then, also, Bluetooth speakers have just gotten more popular, and the fact is, you never know where your music might be played and when it might be played in mono. Let me show you what the problem is. First, I'm going to use the dual pan effect to set this up as mono because I want you to see what happens in the phase meter. So we'll just turn that on, and then I'll play the loop once without the Haas effect and once with the Haas effect. See if you can hear the difference. Yeah, yuck, right? It got quieter and it got sort of a weird, phasey sound to it. But don't worry, the mistake I made wasn't that I was using the Haas effect, it was that I was using it poorly. And let's be clear, double tracking is probably the best widening effect, but the performance has to be reasonably tight so the differences aren't distracting. And really, at the end of the day, it's a creative decision whether or not to use the Haas effect or to double track. Okay, first let's talk about why this happens, and then I'll show you several techniques you can use to minimize the impact in mono. The reason the mono version of the track sounds thin and weak is because of something called phase cancellation. We'll get a little sciencey here, but stick with me and there's some fun parts in this. Sound is made up of waves that can be graphed like this simple tone going above and below a 0 point. When another tone is put in there, the two tones get added together. These two tones, the blue and red lines, are identical, but one comes a little later than the other. Now you won't really hear them as individual sounds because they get added together, or summed, at the output, and we only hear the combined tone, that gold line, as being almost twice as loud as the individual tones, and if I put them right on top of each other, it would be twice as loud, and I'll say loud in quotes because it's a perception thing. But look what happens to the yellow combined tone as we delay the second tone a bit further. See how that came down a bit? And let's delay a little bit more. And now the yellow tone is even quieter than either one of the individual tones that initiated it. And if you line this up just right, that sound that you're hearing pretty much goes away. And in the worst case, if the two tones were almost perfectly misaligned, the signal we hear is virtually non-existent. These are all examples of phase cancellation with the opposing push-pull of two or more signals diminishing what we hear. When it's unintentional, phase cancellation is what audio experts refer to as bad. However, if you play synthesizer or electric guitar, you're probably already familiar with the creative use of phase cancellation. Did you ever wonder what your phase pedal does? Well, let me show you, because this demonstrates another important point. Here we have something that should be familiar to all electric guitarists, and probably you synth players as well, a phase pedal. What a phase pedal does is split a signal in two, delay one of those signals, and then add it back to the first one. But that delay timing shifts back and forth to give a pleasant sweeping effect. Let's hear and see what that looks like. Here we have a tone generator set to pink noise, a phase pedal, and then the spectrometer. Let's turn on the tone generator, and there you hear the pleasant pink noise in the background. And let's turn on the phaser and see what happens. What you're hearing and seeing is phase cancellation being swept back and forth in a pleasing manner, as I said before. Well, that sounds sort of cool. So what's the problem? The problem is this, that the Haas effect uses a static delay. It doesn't change, so those cancellation notches never move and look like this. Here Haas is being applied to our pink noise with a 3 millisecond delay. Now notice how the cancellation notches move as we change the delay, which I'm doing off screen, from 3 milliseconds to say 8 milliseconds, and then 14 milliseconds. So different frequencies are affected by different delay settings. That'll become important in a moment. You may have also noticed that there are more notches as we increase the delay, and maybe even looking at this chart you're thinking, it doesn't look so bad. Well, let's pull up a single frequency. Here's a nice 150 Hz tone. Sounds fine, but I calculated that with our current 14 millisecond delay, one of those cancellation notches occurs at 250 Hz. So let's punch that in and see what happens. Oh, yikes, right? What happened to our tone? Well, actually I think it's leaking through a little bit. It's just kind of hanging on by its teeth. Well, let's try another one at 750 Hz. Yep, same thing. And remember, there's a bunch more of these around here. So if we sweep around a little bit, there they are. Of course, your music will never be stuck on exact frequencies, but everything right around those cancellation points is getting sucked down too, like water swirling down a drain. So we can't ignore this problem. But no worries, because here's what we can do to make it better. One of the first things to try is just different delay times. As you saw, different delay times impact different frequencies. Here the phase meter really comes in handy because this correlation meter at the bottom shows where cancellation is occurring. The meter going to the left indicates cancellation. However, I'll say I'm finding that while playing with this, it's best to use your ears instead of your eyes because in some cases the audio doesn't sound as bad as the meter might imply. Okay, in this example, the audio is first hitting the phase meter in stereo, then the dual pan, which converts it to mono, and that's what you'll hear. We'll start with no delay and then try a few different settings. Notice how the volume immediately drops, and then listen for differences like phasiness or weak frequencies between each sample. Again, we'll start with no delay, and then I'll go to 3, 5, 7, and on from there. Here we go. Okay, that sounded all right. A couple of important notes here. First, as you're trying out different delays in mono, bear in mind that once you get over about 30 or 40 milliseconds, the Haas effect turns into more of an echo than a spreading effect. Second, there's also a widening effect called the out-of-speaker trick. Here, instead of delaying the second signal, you reverse the phase of one of the tracks. So let's take a look at that. First of all, we'll set the delay to 0. Then we'll get our input controls up here. And we can reverse the phase of the second track. So let's hear what that sounds like in stereo, and then I'll play it back in mono. Oh, you can guess what happened, right? In mono, you get nothing. So I highly recommend totally forgetting about the out-of-speaker trick and never trying to use it. The next thing to try uses some EQ plugins. The idea here is to use EQ adjustments to make the two tracks different enough that when they're merged together, they don't cancel out as much. To demonstrate, I duplicated our original two tracks, but added EQ plugins to each of the two new tracks. Then I alternately raised and lowered some ranges of frequencies. So here you see I lowered around 110 Hz on one side, and on the other side I raised around 110 Hz, and then did that in a couple more ranges. This works, but I found it challenging to select the right frequency so that the tracks didn't sound too lopsided in stereo. But anyway, let's listen to these in comparison to our original Haas tracks. First, we'll hear the original Haas tracks in stereo, then the EQ'd version in stereo. After that, I'll play them back in mono. The third thing to try, especially if you're using amp sims, is to try different settings on the second track, or maybe a different amp or cabinet, anything to change up the sound a little bit. Even though I think the loop I'm using was already amped, I made a copy of the second track and then tried a few different settings on the Ampere Blackface, along with a few different cabinets, until I found a sound I liked after putting it back together with the original. I also took care to make sure that the Ampere plugin wasn't changing the channel's volume. And honestly, I think this came out sounding better in mono and stereo, but you judge for yourself. First in stereo, and then in mono. Not bad, right? These next couple of tricks come from Craig Anderton. If you don't know who Craig is, I think I'm correct in saying that he's been writing about DAW systems from before they even existed. Seriously. His Cakewalk Sonar books helped me learn my way around a DAW, and he's probably forgotten more about DAWs than I'll ever know. That's a compliment in case you weren't sure. Anyway, I'll give you an overview of a couple of Craig's tricks, and there are links to these articles in the description. The first trick uses delayed FX channels to keep some of the original signal in the center while sending delayed versions to the side. That way when the audio is collapsed down to mono, there's still some continuity. Okay, let's start this up from scratch. For this demo, we just have the one track in mono. Next, we'll create an FX bus and put the analog delay in at 100% wet and with everything else null. And the easy way to do this is just to grab the effect and drag it over here to the sends box. Now we want to clear everything out and put just 1 millisecond in here and set everything else to 0. We don't want any cut, high cut, or drive. Turn this off and everything's set. And then let's call this delay 1. Okay, now we need to add a second FX channel. Let's just do the same thing all over again. Let's call this one delay 2. And let's pin that and copy all the settings from our first delay into our second one. And then we want to set a different delay time. So to get a 12 millisecond delay, since we could only set the first one down to 1, we'll make this 13. And then finally, let's take one channel and put it full left, take the other one, put it full right, and let's hear what it sounds like. Okay, not bad. Craig makes a point though. You may have noticed that you don't get as much of a spread sound with that center channel running. Well, we can lower this, but before we do that, we want to flip these over so that they're pre-fader. Otherwise, when we lower the fader, we'll lower the sides at the same time. Well, let's bring that down to say 6 dB or so and give that a listen. Okay, and you could hear with that how when we brought down the center channel, you got more of a stereo spread sound. And we went to mono, sounded fine. The second trick from Craig is not a Haas delay, but instead uses multiband compressors to send some frequencies to one side and the other frequencies to the other side. The great thing about this approach is that there's no phase cancellation from using a delay, but the downside is that the stereo image doesn't jump out of the speakers as much as it does with the Haas effect. Also, sorry, but my understanding is that the multiband compressor is not available in the artist version of Studio One. But stick around and I'll show you how to do something similar using a couple of EQ plugins. Okay, let's start with the multiband compressor already on one track. First thing to remember is we're not using this for compression. So let's go up here, click All Relative, and then change this compression ratio to 1. Straight on up the line. And now unselect Edit All Relative. Next, let's copy paste this to the other track. And we've got it up on our screen. Now to save time on the video, I've already selected the frequency ranges here. The important thing is they have to be exactly the same between these two multiband compressors. And then all it remains to do is alternately mute the ranges between the compressors. So some frequencies are going to one side and the other frequencies are going to the other side. Also, since this reduces the volume level, you may need to boost it up a little bit here as I've done with these gains. But let's give it a listen, first in stereo and then in mono. Again, it doesn't jump out at you like Haas does, but it does spread the sound out. And to me, it sounds a little bit louder when it goes to mono, so that's something to be aware of. The other aspect of this is that unlike the Haas effect, you're not stuck with hard panning to both sides. You can pull it in if you want. So let's start in full stereo and then pull it into the center a bit. For those who don't have a multiband compressor, I tried to work out a similar approach using EQs by sending pink noise through the multiband compressors, followed by a couple of EQs in standby mode, and then trying to adjust the EQs to match that pattern, like this. So let's turn this on and hear the EQ version in stereo and then mono. Yeah, not bad. For this last demo, I'm breaking my own rule about not using any third-party plugins to make you aware of the fact that there are some wonderful plugins out there like this PS22 plugin from Waves that do an excellent job of spreading a mono track across a stereo field, while at the same time mitigating some of the problems that we saw using other methods. Also, to give you a heads up that if you use one of these plugins, remember to go to your track and change it from a mono track to a stereo track. Okay, let's give this a listen, first in stereo and then in mono. That works really well, doesn't it? And there you have it. Now, not only do you know about the Haas effect, but you also know how to step around the pitfall that I fell into. Also, even though all these demos were on a solo instrument, it's best to make these adjustments in terms of the entire mix and after you've already made your initial EQ and compression settings. Either way, it's always good practice to start mixing in mono and then occasionally come back to check your mix in mono just to make sure it still holds up. And if you use the Haas effect, then definitely check your mix in mono so you don't end up like me, crestfallen at hearing my hard work mangled by phase cancellation. This is Jeffrey. Until next time, happy mixing, my friends.